Hello, everybody. If it's your first time with us, welcome. And if you've been here before, welcome back. Today's video on checkmate patterns, we're going to learn one of the most difficult checkmate patterns to accomplish in chess, and that is how do we use our bishop and knight together, two minor pieces, in order to checkmate the opposing black king. Just what makes this checkmate pattern so difficult? Well, for starters, let's take a look here. I've got the moves in our line on the side already. You'll notice that we have a 34 move line already planned out to show to you guys. Now, don't be discouraged. This does not by any means mean that you're going to have to memorize 34 concrete moves to be able to play this. But what it means is that the patterns for how this bishop and how this knight work together are such that if we don't quite keep the black king contained, if we don't do things just right, it could very easily add on an extra 10 moves in order to get back to where we were before. You do that a couple of times, and suddenly you're going to have hit that 50 move rule. Remember that if we make 50 moves without a pawn move or a capture, then we're going to have a draw in chess, and this is one of those checkmates where that can very much come into play. Many grandmasters have drawn this endgame simply from making a slight mistake and having to have made too many moves to be able to finish it off. But don't be discouraged, fear not. We're going to show you how to do this, how to do one of the best checkmate patterns, and I think one of the most beautiful ones. So let's go ahead and take a look at the position here. We have our king, knight, and bishop in the center. Black's king is in the center, like he's always hoping, trying not to get checkmated, keeping away from the edge of the board. We're going to need to move him to the edge, and one of the important things to note in this checkmate pattern is that ultimately we have to get him into a corner that's the same color of our bishop. So ultimately our goal is going to be to drive the black king to the A8 corner. H8 would work as well. We're going to be working toward A8 in this problem, but it's going to have to be one of those. Now, if you find yourself on the black piece side of this scenario, a good strategy for defense is to stay in the center as long as you can, and then once you do get forced from the center, try to make your way over to the other corner. You know that A8's where they're going to try to mate you, so you're going to try to get to H8, spend as much time on that side, and force white to force you to where he wants to deliver checkmate. So a tall task in order for white today. How do we start by going about this? Well, the first move that I'm going to play here is going to be knight G2. Now, this may seem like an odd move. I'm moving away from the king. I make this move for two reasons. The first is that it does cut off a very important square from the black king, which is F4. It stops him from being able to come up to this square. The second is that this move really illustrates the way in which the knight and bishop can work together. So with this knight on G2, it's blocking off H4, F4, E3, and E1, and the black bishop is covering all the dark squares around there. So already you can see we have this little box that's preventing the black king from ever getting over to these two pieces. So this is a small example of how we're going to try to be using these two pieces to draw lines to force black to where we want him to go. Ultimately, we have to use our knight carefully in order to control the dark squares. Our bishop is only ever going to control the light squares, so we have to be able to use our knight effectively in order to control the dark ones, or else we're not going to be able to finish off the job. So let's go ahead and say black plays king to F5. All right, well, we know that not only are we going to have to use our bishop and knight, we have to use the king as well. We already have this nice wall. Let's bring our king up and cut off another square as well. King D4, cutting off E5 now. Black's trying to keep toward the center, so king to E6. Now what we have to start thinking of is how can we move that wall forward? We have the wall down here with our bishop and knight. How can we get the knight to start cutting off some more squares? Well, knight F4 check here. King comes back to F5. Now he's attacking the knight. And now we can go to a square that will still hold f4, which will be anywhere, but try to block a new square from the king. So knight to h3. Now the knight is still holding f4, the bishop has this wall, and the knight is stopping the king from coming to g5. Our king's stopping king to e5, so look at that. Already the black king is forced backwards. Using our pieces together, the king and the knight to control the dark squares, the bishop to control the light ones. So black comes king e6, trying to stay toward the center, trying to last as long as possible. Bishop to g4 here. Our king is already controlling these squares. The bishop is now making sure he doesn't come back forward to f5. King to d6 is our next move, keeping in the center for as long as possible. Note that if black had gone to f6, our knight is already holding g5, and we can play the move king to e5, and our bishop and knight already have this nice wall over here, so using those pieces to create that wall. After king d6, now we're going to have to start bringing that knight forward more. We need to use it to control dark squares and keep pushing black back. Knight f4. It's controlling the same square as the bishop, but like we said, we're just moving it to somewhere else where it can help a little bit more. Here, black has to make a decision. White is controlling all of these squares around the black king. He can either move towards c6 and c7, or he can come to e7. Now, what I said in the start was, remember, we would love for black's king to come over to a8. We have to get him to a light square in order to deliver checkmate. So black here is going to play king e7. He's heading for the other corner where it's going to take longer to finish off the job. All right, let's chase him down. King e5. Our bishop's covering this square. We're cutting off black's forward progress attempts and making sure he goes to the edge. King f7, and now we're going to play a knight move here, knight to e6. What's the purpose of this move? Well, it does cut off the g7 square from the opponent's king, but also it rebuilds the wall on the edge here. The bishop and knight are now covering this fifth rank so that black can't try to escape back into the center this way. So knight e6, the king comes back to e7, and then knight to g5. We're holding off the g7 square. Our bishop's cutting off the d7 square with a nice discovery there, and black has to go back to the 8th suddenly. So king to f8, once again heading for the safe haven of the h8 corner, hopefully, not wanting to have to go to a8 where we can deliver mate. King to f6, and king to g8. Now this is another important moment. We're getting ready to stop that black king. You notice that our knight is already cutting off h7, but like we mentioned before, we need that knight to control the dark squares. We could play king to g6 here, but then he can start trying to sneak back around out the e7 square. So bishop f5 allows our king to keep control of e7, f7, and g7, and our bishop now controls h7 so that we can use our knight to try to get control of h8. This is really important. The bishop can never attack that h8 square, so now that the black king is on the edge of the board, we have to find a way to force him to the other corner to deliver mate. So we have to use the knight to control each of these dark squares along the way. We're going to have to solve that problem while using the bishop together with it. So king to h8. Well, now our knight's already on a beautiful square to be able to help out with this. What should we play in order to wrench that black king off of h8? Knight f7 check. The king has to come to g8. Remember, our bishop controls h7, very important. And now we want to be able to control the g8 square next because we need to keep pushing black to the left. Black only move in this scenario is to play king to f8. So what we want to do here is just make a waiting move so that our next turn we can take control of g8. So I'm just going to play bishop g6, and after king f8, bishop h7. Now we're controlling both h8 and g8, and we're forcing black to move toward the corner. King to e8, and now comes a very important part of our strategy here. The first line I'm going to show you is a pattern that repeats itself and is a great one to know how to finish off this checkmate, but there's two important points to it. We need to make the move knight to e5 here. Now, after knight to e5, black has two options, either king to d8 or king to f8. King to d8 looks like it might potentially get black to escape and get back to the center of the board. We're actually going to examine this move second. The first one I want to show you is the move king to f8. That way you know the pattern of what to do with the knight in order to drive the king to the corner. So let's say that black plays king to f8. Now we're going to use that knight to drive black off the dark squares. Knight d7 check. After king to e8, we play king to e6. If he keeps going to the side, which he has to, king to d6. And after king back to e8, there's a very critical moment here where the knight is still holding this f8 square. Our king is holding e7 and d7. Black wants to sneak out here, but we have the very powerful bishop g6 check, cutting off f7 and hitting e8 at the same time, and now black is forced to go to the side. After king d8, we're going to repeat this pattern with the knight. Remember when we were on the f file, we moved that knight back to e5. This time we're going to move it to c5. After knight c5, king c8. Now we want to just play a waiting move. We know that when the king plays back to d8, we're going to move that knight check again and repeat the pattern. So we simply need to make a waiting move with our bishop. Bishop h5, king to d8, and what's next? Knight b7. We're repeating the same pattern that we did before. After king to c8, now protect the knight, king c6, king b8, king b6, and now that king is running out of squares. We've already got him pretty fenced in. After king c8, what's the critical move here so that the black king doesn't escape? Bishop g5 check. Now black is stuck here. He's only got two squares to go back and forth to. We're controlling everything around him. And all we have to do is figure out how to finish it off. How do we mate from this position? Well, the next big question here is how are we going to deliver check? We don't want to just cut off his squares and have a stalemate. So we know that he's on a dark square right now. The only piece that can attack that dark square is going to be our knight. So if we want to attack b8 with the knight, we can do that from one of three squares. We can either do it from d7, c6, or a6. So if we were to imagine our knight on those squares, which would be the best? Well, if our knight were on d7 right now, if we could magically play knight d7 check, the problem with that is that not only could the king play to a8, he could also play back to c8, because a knight here on d7 would block the bishop's diagonal, and that would let black escape. So moving the knight to d7 is not going to be our best plan. What about knight to c6? Well, if we play knight to c6, the bishop's diagonal is not blocked, so that's a bonus. But after king to a8, what we would like to do is play the move bishop f3 and give checkmate. However, this knight is on c6 in the way if we're thinking about moving it to c6. So c6 is not the best square for the knight either. What's our last option? Well, a6, of course. If we could play knight to a6 right now, then we would have checkmate in 2. The bishop holds the c8 square, the king would have to play king to a8, and next turn we could play bishop f3. So knowing that, and looking at where we are right now, how can we maneuver our knight to a6? Well, knight to c5, getting ready to come to the a6 square. Black plays king to a8, and what do we do now? If you said knight a6, that would be a trap, right? We have to play knight a6 with check. So we need to wait one more move, because if we go knight a6 right now, that cuts off b8, and oh no, after all that work, it would be a stalemate. So we need one more waiting move, and we can do that pretty well anywhere along this diagonal with the bishop. We just need to make sure that we don't let the king sneak back out of c8. So we'll play bishop d7 here. King b8, And now we should know the final way to deliver the final blow. Knight a6 check, king back to a8, and what's the finishing move? Bishop c6. Bam! White's got it. That's checkmate. And that's the very important pattern to remember there. Using the knight, controlling the dark squares, sliding the king all the way over to the left to control what you want and get checkmate. Now, let's go back to that earlier position after knight to e5. I know this is jumping back several moves, but we were showing how to move that knight to control the dark squares. That only really works if black steps back in front of our king, right? So what was black's other option here? What happens if black plays king to d8? Now's where we have to go back to that idea of building the fence. How do we use our bishop and our knight to build a fence to keep black's king on the side of the board? Black wants to play moves like king to c7, king to d6, and start coming back into the center. So where can I move my pieces in order to prevent that from happening? The next critical move here is knight to c4. The knight now controls the d6 and b6 squares. So after black plays king to c7, we can come over and play bishop e5. And now look at this bishop and knight working together. We're still keeping the black king in a fence. Our king's holding the squares here, our bishop and our knight are holding over here. And even though it looked for a moment like black was going to escape, we're able to build that fence. So that's why it's so important to see how the bishop and knight can work together. After king d8, another critical moment comes up. If we decide to move our king over, which seems like the most natural thing, then his king can come back to e8, and it ends up being very tricky because our knight is too far away. It's 2 moves away from being able to come to d7 and control this e8 square, so black's going to try to escape back to the corner where we can't mate him now. So already black's going, okay, I tried for the center, you've blocked me from getting to the center, I'm going to run back to the corner. So how do we stop black from achieving this plan? Well, another little sneaky move here, bishop to c6. Very awkward moving your bishop to where the king can step forward and attack it, but the point is that now we're controlling e8 and e7. Our king controls e7, bishop d7, and after king attacks the bishop, rather than moving back to where we were before, we can play bishop to b5, and now this wall is building even stronger around the king. Look at that. He's now limited to only a few squares in the corner he does not want to be in. So even though it looked for that moment like the black king might not escape, we use that knight and that bishop to build a fence, build a wall, and keep him from getting out. Let's take a look at that one more time here. So if the king runs to the center, we're going to play knight to c4. And after he comes knight c7, bishop e4 is the critical move, building that fence. If he runs back toward the corner, bishop c6, cutting off the e8 square. Those 3 moves are critical to being able to make this pattern work. After king c7, bishop b5, and once king d8 happens, we now have that fence. Let's make sure we bring our king in to be able to finish things off. King to e6, king back to c7. We already have this beautiful fence with the knight and bishop. We don't want to really move either of those pieces if we don't have to. So if we can keep cutting squares off with our king, that's what we're going to do. King e7 here, cutting off d8 and d7. King to c8, king to d6, cutting off the c7 square. And now after king to d8, this should look very similar to what we saw in our last pattern when we were using the knight to move the king to the side. The one difference is that now our bishop is on b5 instead of being over here on f7, so it's controlling the e8 square from a different angle. And we know that we want to use our knight to attack d8. So we're going to try to play knight a5 and a7 here. So how are we going to reposition our pieces to do that? Well, knight a5 to start with. King c8, only move. And now we're going to start a reposition of the bishop with bishop c4. The problem with the bishop being on b5 here is that if the king comes back and we play this knight check, eventually we want to move our king to c6, and then the bishop won't be able to control the e8 square. So we're going to need to reposition this bishop in order to control e8 from f7, like we saw in the first line. So knight a5, king c8, bishop c4, king back to d8, and bishop f7. Now we're controlling the e8 square, and this should look familiar to you again. Now we're pretty well back to where we were in the last line. After king c8, what should we do? A little review, right? Well, we want to be able to play that knight b7 move with check when the king is on d8, but we can't do that in this situation because, well, the black king could just take it. This is where, once again, we need that waiting move. Bishop g6. King to d8, and what are we going to do? Knight b7. King c8, king c6, defend the knight. King b8, king b6. We're once again blocking him out. Our king is building that fence. And after king to c8, what's our critical check? Bishop f5, and now the black king is stuck between those two squares. What square are we going to try to maneuver the knight to? How are we going to finish this off from what we saw before? What's the best place to put the knight to finish this mate? Well, we need to move him to a6. So first, knight c5, king a8, and what do we play now? One more waiting move. Bishop d7, king b8, knight a6 check, king to a8, and bishop to c6 checkmate. And that, folks, is how we use the knight and the bishop together in order to ensure the black king does not escape, fence him in all the way along the way, and deliver that final finishing checkmate. If you have any questions, be sure to leave them in the comment section below. And if this is a checkmate you really want to learn, I definitely suggest setting this up, practicing on the board. I know when I was learning this, I used to set this position up and put a timer on, and I would give myself 2 minutes against the computer to try and checkmate the black king. And let me tell you, it took about a week before I was able to accomplish that, of doing that maybe 3 times a day, 4 or 5 times a day for a week. So this is one that takes a lot of practice, but hopefully this gives you the pattern, gives you the right way of thinking in order to make it happen. Let me know if you have any questions. I hope you've enjoyed, and best of luck out there. Get those bishops and knights doing all the damage they can.